This is the story of Collier Brook Farm, which stood on Bag Lane in Atherton for 4 centuries, but unfortunately this listed building was pulled down in August 2020. The farm was built sometime in the mid-18th century when Atherton was more commonly known as Chowbent, and it was a large market village with around 2,000 inhabitants. The name of the farm, Collier Brook, was derived from a small brook which ran through land belonging to the farm. This in turn is named after the Collier family, who farmed this particular piece of land in the 18th century. The farm is mentioned in the Poor Law rate books from the early 19th century, and this tells us a little bit more about the structure of the property. Rates were a form of tax used to maintain local infrastructure, and the Poor Law Rates Payers books tell us the names and addresses of Atherton residents and how much they paid towards the upkeep of the poor. In the 1802 rate book, the house was described as, "The house is taken part down and not inhabitable." This would seem to verify later views by architectural historians that the farm was altered in the 18th century and parts of the timber frame were older than the others. In the 1802 rate book, the owner or occupier was listed as Mrs. Betty Megson for the late John Collier. John Collier ties us with the origins of the farm, but Betty Megson's connection is a little bit more blurred. Betty, or Elizabeth as she was known, was born Elizabeth Farrer in 1759. In September 1787, she married Christopher Megson at St. Mary's Church in Lee, which was a nearby town, so we know she had a connection to the area. They were married by license rather than the usual banns, which were a series of announcements made over a number of weeks preceding a wedding. Licenses were granted in exceptional circumstances, and we can see that Christopher and Elizabeth's first child, a daughter, Diana, was born in June 1787, 3 months before the couple married, so this was very much an exceptional circumstance. Diana was later baptised at Lee in April 1788, and the family lived in Atherton at this time. Their second child, Eliza Maria Megson, was baptised at Lee, but the family lived in Rochdale at that time. Unfortunately, Christopher Megson had taken his own life in January 1790, either when his wife was heavily pregnant or when she had the newborn baby. Elizabeth Megson, however, survived and prospered. She printed notices in local newspapers that she intended to carry on her husband's business as a spirit merchant. How long Elizabeth and her daughters spent at Collier Brook Farm is not known, but we know that Elizabeth maintained her lifelong ties with the area. She was living in the nearby town of Tylsey when she died in 1833, and she was buried in Lee. At the time of her death, her estate was valued at just less than £14,000, and when this figure is adjusted for inflation, it means Elizabeth would have been a millionaire by modern standards. The next residents of Collier Brook Farm were the Seddon family, who were recorded there from 1803. Head of the family was James Seddon, who married Anne Collier in 1798 at St. Mary's Parish Church in Lee. It is likely that Anne was related to the Collier family who originally farmed at Collier Brook. Anne and James had 11 children together: John, James, Thomas, Betty, Anne, Margaret, Samuel, Lydia, Alice, Jane, and Martha. Several of the Seddon children were born at 2-year intervals, which mean Anne Seddon spent more or less the first 2 decades of her married life pregnant. Anne was 13 years older than her husband, and baptism records at Chowbent Chapel, where the family worshipped, would suggest that she was 34 when her first child was born and 57 when her last child was born. The first proper surviving census from 1841 shows James aged 62, and he was recorded as a farmer, with Anne, 4 of their children, and 2 grandchildren living at the property. The rate books from the same year reveal that the farm was about 10 acres in size, and its rateable value was £47, 4 shillings and 7 pence. The last census to show the Seddon family living at Collier Brook was the 1851 census. By this time, the family unit living at the farmhouse had shrunk to just James, his daughter Lydia, and 2 teenage granddaughters, Alice and Martha. Alice, who was born in 1833, was the illegitimate daughter of Lydia. James Seddon died in 1853, and the farm was either sold or tenanted to another family. The next time an owner reappears was in the 1869 Slater's Royal National Commercial Directory, where Edward Davis was recorded living there. Edward Davis was born in Liverpool in 1823, and in 1826 he, his parents and siblings moved to Llangollen in Wales, and they eventually moved to Atherton around 1833. Edward was apprenticed to his uncle Thomas Blakemore, who had a bolt works on Bag Lane, not too far from the farm, and it was Thomas Blakemore who had introduced bolt making into the town in 1826. By the age of 27, Edward had started his own business manufacturing bolts and screws, and this eventually became a common industry in the town, and it had its origins in the nail-making trade, which had been prominent in Atherton since the 14th century. Edward's first bolt works were located on Youth Lane in Atherton, now Morley Street, where he also lived with his widowed mother and 6 siblings and niece. In 1850, Edward married Jane Buller. Jane had been a silk weaver on a hand loom at the time of her marriage. She lived with her mother and 6 brothers on Dan Lane in Atherton, and it's likely that Jane and Edward met when he moved his bulwarks to Dan Lane. Edward later moved his bulwarks to the valley, and the couple lived on Bolton Road. In 1865, Edward moved his business again to Bag Lane, on a site that was opposite Collier Brook Farm. This was later known as the Collier Brook Bolt Works. It was built in 1856 by John Buller, who was likely a relation of Jane's, and it was extended over the following years. It was later inherited by a different John Buller, who was Edward and Jane's nephew. The site closed in 1994, but the building was listed in 1991, which means it's the only surviving building in the town relating to the Bolt Works. In the 1871 census, Edward and Jane can be found living at Collier Brook Farm. In that same year, he was honoured by the local Baptist church for his work as a superintendent at the Sunday school. By the time of the 1881 census, the Davies' fortune had grown. Edward was a mixture of bolt manufacturer, employing 70 people, and a farmer of 64 acres, employing 6 people. Edward and Jane also employed a domestic servant in their home, Alice Jones. Their growing prosperity was also reflected in the house in which they lived. In local newspapers, the building was referred to as Collier Brook House, which sounds more appealing than farm, and it lends itself to the Davies' social prominence. In local trade directories, Edward was listed as a private resident, and he was briefly a member of the Board of Guardians of the town. Edward also started to expand the house with new windows and the addition of a conservatory in the late 19th century. Unfortunately, Jane Davies died in 1883 at the age of 59. Edward remarried later that year to Elizabeth Holt, who was a respectable widow, and for over 20 years she was also a Sunday school teacher at the Baptist chapel, and it's likely that Edward and Elizabeth knew each other through the chapel. Sadly, Edward died in 1890 after suffering from diabetes and Bright's disease. He was a well-respected member of local society, and his funeral procession was 8 carriages long, and along that route people lined the streets and blinds were drawn out of respect. The Bolt workshop was closed so that the workers could visit the cemetery. The censuses for 1891 and 1901 show Elizabeth Davies living at Collier Brook Farm with her daughters from her previous marriage, Lydia, Rachel and Ethel. Elizabeth also played a prominent role in Atherton society. She was part of the Ladies' Sewing Meeting and the Atherton Committee Sick Nursing Association. She was also entitled to vote as a county elector in 1893, but not in parliamentary elections, which would not be granted to some women until 1918. Unfortunately, Elizabeth died after a short illness in 1906, just as she was planning to sell Collier Brook Farm and retire to Blackpool. After the death of Elizabeth Davies, the farm was purchased by Hugh Whittle and his wife Alice, and they moved in with their 8 children, Richard, Charles, George, Henry, Ellen, Deborah, Edith and Hugh. Several generations of the Whittle family lived at Collier Brook over the 20th century, and the family was so closely tied to the property that it was known locally as Whittle's Farm. In the early 20th century, a 4-roomed cottage was built adjoining the farmhouse, and it was known as Collier Brook Cottage. It was first mentioned in the 1911 census, where we can see it was the home of Edwin Woodward and his family. By 1914, it was the home of James and Ruth Woodward and their 2 sons, Harry and William. James Woodward later enlisted to fight during the First World War. It was in the years after the First World War that there were great changes for Atherton and Collier Brook Farm. In 1919, the House, Town and Planning Act, also known as the Addison Act, was passed by the government, and it followed up on the promise of new social housing offered by David Lloyd George of habitations fit for heroes who have won the war. This legislation directly challenged the persistent social issues of inadequate living conditions faced by the working class communities in Britain. In 1911, there were 138 households in Atherton which consisted of 9 or more people living in houses of 4 rooms or 3 rooms. The Addison Act marked the pinnacle of social reform enacted by the Liberal Party in this period, such as the Old Age Pension Act of 1908 and the National Insurance Act of 1911. In May 1919, Atherton Urban District Council adopted the Act and began to purchase land around 2 key sites to build their new local authority houses. Collier Brook Farm and Hagfold Farm were chosen. Their undeveloped land was ideal, especially as these new estates featured unprecedented designs for working class housing, including semi-detached properties and large front and rear gardens. Hagfold Farm was eventually consumed by the estate in the 1930s, but Collier Brook Farmhouse was not, and by 1921 there were some 68 council properties built in between the farmhouse and the brook. After the deaths of Hugh and Alice Whittle in the early 1950s, their son George and his wife Clarice took over the running of Collier Brook Farm. Still living at the cottage at this time was James Woodward, who had survived the First World War and returned to Atherton to work in the pulp works. He remained at the cottage until the mid-1960s. In the 1970s, James and Eleanor Turner lived there, and in the 1980s, the son and daughter-in-law of George and Clarice moved into the property. Collier Brook Farm in the late 20th century is fondly remembered by local residents, and many people fondly recall George Whittle delivering their milk. George passed away in 1994 and Clarice a few years later in 1999. After the death of Clarice Whittle, the farmhouse stood empty. In 2006, plans were submitted to build houses on the site of the former farm, and late 19th century and early 20th century farm buildings, including the cottage, were demolished to create room. These plans fell through. In 2016, new plans were submitted, again to build 16 houses on the site of the farm, but to turn one of the barns and the farmhouse into offices. Again, these plans prompted changes, and part of the farmhouse was demolished during this time, and the slate roof was replaced with corrugated steel. These structural changes were odd because the farmhouse was a Grade 2 listed building, although it received its listed building status relatively late in 1991. At one time, the interior of the farm contained wattle and daub walls, panelled doors, fireplace surrounds, and a staircase, all dating to the 18th century. However, as the building was unoccupied for a number of years, these features were sadly lost through theft and fire. However, the plans to develop Collier Brook Farm fell through again, and the house and site were neglected and left exposed to the elements and to vandals. The barn was demolished in the summer of 2020, and shortly after, in August 2020, the remains of the farmhouse were also demolished. It is such a shame that 4 centuries of history, encapsulated in the tangible walls of Collier Brook Farm, were left to rot, and now have been lost forever. Hopefully this story of Collier Brook Farmhouse and its former residents will serve as a reminder of this long-lost building, and it will remind us of our need to protect our historic homes and structures.